Hi, everyone, and welcome to this first meeting of the ReImagine Israel-Palestine Learning Corps. So great to see those of you who can join us live on this call. And I know it's kind of a hard time during the workday for others to make. So if you're watching this after the fact, welcome. Eager to see you live on a future call. Today we'll start with just kind of briefly going over what the format for the Learning Corps will look like. I know that this is kind of a new program from Telos, and as we all learn and adjust together, I want to give you a little bit more of a roadmap of what to expect moving forward. And then we've got Telos co-founder and executive director Todd Deatherage with us, who is our in-house expert on Christian Zionism. So we'll have a great chance to learn from him and have a question and answer session with him. And then we'll go off the record for our conversation about Till Kingdom Come. Okay, if you're on the call and you haven't seen that yet, still, I think a lot of interesting thoughts and insights to share. And just a reminder that if you haven't watched that yet, but you would like to, the link is live through next Thursday, the 26th. So with the Telos Learning Corps, our vision moving forward is this is a really community-based event. So we'll have some events like this with a guest expert, not always from Telos, we just happen to have one with us today. And those will be the events that are recorded. So if you can't join us live, you'll have a chance to catch up with them. This is our chance to really lean into learning from folks, asking them questions, discussing and processing a little bit. At the top of each month, we'll send out an email with some guiding thoughts and resources on our theme. We didn't do that this month because we didn't want to overload you with pre-work before we had a chance to check in with each other. And then after the session with our guest expert, we'll send some of the resources and the recording for those of you who can't join us live, suggested follow-up items. And at the end of the month, or kind of middle of the month, we'll have a second session where we can gather as a community without anyone outside. That'll be off the record, it won't be recorded, and that'll be a chance for us to really process as a community, to talk about how we're thinking about what we're learning, to learn some skills, to meet with other folks on the team who are based in Israel, Palestine, and move towards kind of action and holding each other accountable to some of that. So that won't be recorded in the future if you can't join us live. If you've got any questions about that, let me know. Happy to connect and clarify. I'm sure it'll adjust and adapt as we keep going. As any of you who have engaged with Telos programming know, we're super receptive to feedback and want to make sure this is meeting why all of you signed up and joined. So shifting to our conversation today, I'm joined by three colleagues. Sharon Heck is in our DC office. Todd Deatherage is in our DC office. And then Micah Pepper is our fellow for this year, also in our DC office. I don't know if any of you will have met Micah before. You've probably encountered Sharon and Todd, and so we're lucky they're all joining us today. Yeah, we're going to dive right into the conversation. That's enough of me talking for a while. The plan is to have a little bit of a back and forth with Todd to lay some framing ideas on what Christian Zionism is, to unpack some of the things we think it's important for everyone to know about Christian Zionism. We'll open up a time for questions from you all. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat and I can pull them in as Todd and I are talking, or I'll invite you to ask them kind of as we move on. And then, as I mentioned, at a certain point when we feel like we've touched all of that, we can go off record, stop recording, and talk a little bit more about the film Till Kingdom Come, which draws out a lot of these themes. So Todd, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us today. And I'm going to have you kick us off by talking about what is Christian Zionism.
Thanks, Sarah, and welcome everyone. It's really great to have this conversation today. I mean, we talk about Christian Zionism because it's important, because a politicized version of that gets used against people that we care about, and makes the challenge of peacemaking in the Israeli-Palestinian context much harder. And so that's why we talk about it. But we, as in Telos, we know that we begin the work of peacemaking by listening to understand, by accepting the world as it is, not as we want it to be. And so we're trying to figure out what's really underneath this, what's motivating this, what's behind it. And so a great place to start is just trying to understand what Christian Zionism is. There's a lot of ways that Christians in the contemporary world care about Israel and the Jewish people, which is really an aberration for the sort of long history of Jewish-Christian relations, which have been really defined by Christian anti-Semitism toward Jews. But this sort of modern expression that we call Christian Zionism has a lot of different sort of roots, but there's two main channels that lead people into kind of the activism that expresses itself in ways that we find often to be harmful or unhelpful. One of those is through a reading of books of the Bible in a prophetic way. Books of both of the Hebrew Bible, the books like Daniel and Ezekiel, books in the Christian Testament, like the book of Revelation, reading them in a way to kind of interpret contemporary events and to see the modern nation state of Israel and its creation in the mid-20th century as the fulfillment of not only biblical prophecy, but also as the sort of precursor for the end times and the battle of Armageddon and the return of Jesus and all these sorts of things. So there's a lot of folks get to this place through a prophetic biblical interpretation lens. The other way people get to Christian Zionism through their Christian reading of Scripture and their Christian faith is through what we call a covenantal Christian Zionist approach, which means that they read the passages in the Bible, especially in Genesis 12, where God says to Abraham, I'll bless those who bless you and I'll curse those who curse you. And he makes this covenant with Abraham and his descendants. And they read and interpret that to be this sort of enduring covenant that God made with Abraham and his descendants to require people to support the modern nation state of Israel as the contemporary manifestation of that covenant made thousands of years ago to Abraham. And so those are kind of the two main ways that people get at a Christian Zionist approach. Again, and these are the ones that I'm talking about that are organized and active around these particular theologies that have sort of also become ideologies.
Thanks, Todd. And if you've watched Till Kingdom Come already, both of those types of Christian Zionism are really prominent in the film, the prophetic. That's kind of when they're all talking about Revelation and the end times and kind of Armageddon and the fire and brimstone. That's that version. But then also the covenantal, that idea of you bless Israel materially with resources, with support, and you'll be blessed in turn. So if this is a little bit high up there, it's kind of going over your head, or it feels like a lot to track, especially theologically. Watching the film after this will, I think, also help really kind of give an example of what that looks like in practice. Todd, I think especially for folks who don't come from communities that had any kind of Christian Zionism in them, or come from Christian traditions that didn't have a lot of Zionist emphasis, are all Christians who support Israel Christian Zionist, or what are helpful distinctions we can make between different types of folks who support Israel, from Christians who are Christian Zionists to Christians who aren't, who are peacemakers, to Zionists who aren't Christian? How can we define these terms in a way that helps us understand the nuance of some of the communities who care about Israel?
Yeah, it's always a temptation to, as quickly as we can, reduce people and put them in the box we need them to be in as efficiently as possible, so we don't have to kind of do the work. The reality is there are a lot of Christians who would identify themselves as supporters of Israel who would not really be Christian Zionists, or certainly not part of an activist Christian Zionist movement, and would not have arrived at their support of Israel in the ways that we just described through the prophetic or the covenantal kinds of approaches. So there are many reasons and ways that to support Israel, and there's more than one definition of what it means to support Israel. And there are some people who would actually Christians who would support Israel who would think that what the things the Christian Zionists support are actually antithetical to Israel's long-term future. So there's a lot of complexity in that. But also, as I said earlier, one of the things you have to keep in mind as you're thinking about this is the long history of Jewish-Christian relations and the Christian origins of anti-Semitism, of weaponized theologies against Jews that begin really early in the Christian history. Many Christians don't equate the modern nation state of Israel with biblical Israel, but they have different ways of interpreting, and they can have different ways of interpreting, like the second coming or of God's covenant with Abraham, but they may still support Israel for historical reasons, for reasons connected to centuries of Jewish persecution, which culminated in the Holocaust. They may see Israel as a necessary safe haven for Jews, given the historical realities. But many of these same Christians also are open to the idea of supporting Palestinians and their connection and their presence in the land, and their vulnerability in the current situation with Israeli control and occupation. And so there's a lot of ways Christians can come to a different understanding of Israel and can support Israel without sort of embracing a Christian Zionist view, which basically says that the land was given to the Jews by God, and that they have an exclusive entitlement to that land, to the exclusion of anyone else, and sort of all other rules are out the window, because this is a providential project that's unfolding right now in the Middle East. And both sort of camps of covenantal Jews and covenantal Christians and prophetic Christians who are coming to this can get to that same place, that this is, this sort of is a divine project. And that God's in the middle of it, and so it's really not something that really is open to question or debate, no matter what the policies are of that nation state or the way they play out toward the other people who live there, including the Christians who live there in the Palestinian Christian community.
I want to pick up on what you were saying about the long history of Christian and Jewish relations, and especially anti-Semitism. And one of the nuances I think really is important to understand in Christian Zionism are the different ways anti-Semitism can show up. And as I think you alluded to, or as we've discussed a little bit before, the most obvious anti-Semitism is some of that Revelation end times theology around the Jews need to go back to Israel to either convert or be slaughtered. That on its face is pretty anti-Semitic. That comes through clearly. But I'd love it if you could also talk a little bit about philo-Semitism, or how a Christian Zionism that loves the Jewish people as an idea, or blesses the Jewish people as an idea, is also anti-Semitic, or how that plays into that history in a way that we also need to be aware of and work to kind of change the rhetoric around.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the way that, again, you have this sort of long history of anti-Semitism, this hostility toward Jews by many Christians, and then you have this current era where there's a lot of Christians who express their love for the Jewish people and their love for Israel and so forth. But what you see in both of these kinds of approaches is often an objectification of the Jewish people that kind of reduces them down to a sort of they're set players in a larger Christian drama. They're sort of pawns in a game that's being played. And so it's whether it's anti-Semitism or just, an expressed love for Jews that we call philo-Semitism. Either way, for some in the Christian Zionist world, Jews are less individual human beings made in God's image, and they're sort of more pawns in a larger Christian story. And so for many Christian Zionists, working for peace is not only a fool's errand, but it actually can impede the unfolding of God's plan. And that kind of support and activism helps, keep not just Palestinians, but Jewish Israelis trapped in a cycle of violence. So there's a way in which this kind of approach, you can say, you can tell someone you love them, but if all the things you're doing are making their life harder, maybe you're not really loving them, right? Maybe you're doing something. Maybe it's more about you than it is about them. And that is the way a lot of my Jewish Israeli friends read all this, and in some ways, it was Jewish Israelis who helped me begin to actually see that sort of really dark side of this philo-Semitism. It's not neutral, and there's actually this other side of it that they are also very, very afraid of. In a similar, they're very cautious and about Christian interest anyway in Jewish, in Jews. But this sort of thing makes them feel again as if they're just they're just pawns in a larger system, and not really being cared about as human beings and individuals.
I think that lays out pretty well kind of what we are working to move people away from. I'd love it if you could talk a little bit about what we hope to replace Christian Zionism with instead. Telos isn't a Christian organization. Not everyone on staff is Christian, but we work with a lot of communities that have this ideology in them, whether they identify as Christian Zionism or not. Can you share a little bit about when we as Telos engage with those communities, where we hope to draw them or invite them into instead to kind of counteract a lot of the violence that you just laid out?
Yeah, as you said, Telos is not a faith-based organization, but we do believe people of faith have a key role to play in conflict resolution and peacemaking. And I am personally, as a Christian, very committed to working with Christian leaders who are trying to make peacemaking central to their Christian formation and discipleship journeys. But we also are, very aware that religion can be weaponized against people. We've talked about, that's true with the creation and perpetuation of anti-Semitism. We also know that the American system of white supremacy and racism that allowed for the perpetuation of slavery and Jim Crow segregation for 350 years would not have been possible in a country like the United States had these things not been, sort of baptized by many Christians. And so while this is, to some a very controversial position, I would say that the marriage of Christian Zionist theology with political power is a weaponization of religious faith and ideology against Palestinians, first and foremost, and also in its own way against Jews. And so the alternative to that, I think, is to really call on folks to draw deeply from their own deepest traditions, and for Christians, that is from their own Christian theology and experience, and to the sources of peacemaking and love of enemies and a way to engage the world that is about healing and repair and reconciliation, rather than division and violence and war and sort of supremacist systems and all that. And so I think there's lots to connect to there. And so our work at Telos with Christians is to help Christians go deeper into their own story and into their own theology and into their own faith traditions to bring that out. Just as we work with non-Christian communities or other religious, Jews and Muslims going into their own traditions, or to people who have a secular worldview into their own, ethical and moral and philosophical understandings of the world and how it works, to draw from that and bring all of those things into the work of, again, creating more just and whole societies that are oriented toward healing and repair and reconciliation.
So with all of that, you started to talk about this a little bit, and I'd like to ask you to dive into a little bit more specifically. For non-Christians, especially those who hear the rhetoric of Christian Zionism, who see maybe its outsized influence over the past 5 or 6 years, why is it important to partner with Christians or, recovering Christian Zionists and other religious actors working to bring about a just peace in Israel-Palestine, as opposed to kind of writing them off or moving away or trying to move without them? Why is it important to try and find or build those coalitions across lines of difference, including religious lines of difference?
I think there's a number of reasons, I would say, but one is just the fact that if you really want to bring change, often that change comes by collaborating with people that are different than you in a lot of ways. Bringing even unlikely allies into your fold. I mean, working across lines of difference actually has enormous power to bring change. If it's easy to stand on the outside and just cast, aspersions at those who are the problems that, as you identify, but what if you can invite some of those people in? What if you can like join with some of the folks from the communities where these challenges are really being manifest, and find ways to work together in common purpose. So I think that, it's easy to sit back and look at this large, vibrant Christian Zionist movement in America and just kind of write off all Christians because this movement exists and there's so much energy and activism around that. But there's so many Christians that are not a part of that movement, that are not active in that way, but could also be completely drawn in to a whole different way. Again, there's so much evidence. There's so many Christians that we know in our Telos world that are working on the things that that are working for mutual flourishing for Israelis and Palestinians, that are working for justice and peace and healing in Israel, Palestine, and other places, and they're doing it not disconnected from their own faith tradition, but actually by deeply connecting into it. And so what if we make common purpose and create these coalitions across lines of difference? That has the potential to bring to sort of exponentially grow the network of people doing this kind of work and bring about the change we seek, rather than if we just stay within our tribe in this sort of minority space and try to do everything on our own without collaboration. It's really hard to get done what you're trying to do.
So part of where Telos comes from is recognizing all of that, and then also believing that culture changes upstream of politics. And part of why we do culture work and do things like this and don't only do political advocacy is because we know that that is an important factor in getting there. And at the same time, as I look back over the past, already 5 or 6, 7 years now, it feels like time is flying. It feels like Christian Zionism and evangelicals who align with that camp have had kind of an increased or outsized impact or influence over American foreign policy in Israel-Palestine. Given that kind of history and context of where we are now, why is understanding Christian Zionism and this relationship important to understanding America's relationship to the Holy Land in kind of a bigger, broader way?
Well, I think you're right. I mean, I think the high watermark for the Christian Zionist movement and the religious right that it connected to was the presidency of Donald Trump, and so we saw this sort of full coming together of that movement with a presidency that embraced its agenda, pretty fully, and lived it out and created policies that were responsive to the requests and demands. Whether or not that's still, obviously, in the last couple of years, that influence has not been there in the same way with the current administration. There are definitely many in Congress who still would be very much, connected to that political camp and so forth. But I think that there's this just points to the real need for those of us who see that is a very problematic approach in the way that it pushes against core values for our country, for ourselves, that it works against the interests of the people we care about in Palestine and Israel on both sides in different ways, but it works against the long-term flourishing of all, as we say, and the potential to end occupation and to transform the conflict and the reality there. And so we have to be able to again build the coalitions that counter that and that point out that there's a better and different way that's available to all of us, but that's necessary for all of us to engage in, so that's not dominant, and be willing to point out the ways in which the policies that are supported and encouraged often from that world are the kinds of things that keep us stuck or lead us deeper into these intransient situations and the perpetuation of conflict that has no end in sight. And it's such a dead end game because it's such a zero-sum approach.
That's really helpful, Todd. I want to draw into, we haven't talked about Palestinian and the Palestinian relationship to Christian Zionism yet. We talked a little bit about America's relationship, Jewish Americans, Jewish Israelis relationship, some of that. But can you talk about how Palestinians, not just Palestinian more broadly, but Palestinian Christians especially, feel about Christian Zionism, or what's the relationship between Christian Zionists and Palestinians?
Well, I don't pretend to speak on behalf of all Palestinians or even a few of them, but Palestinian Christians. But I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that Palestinian Christians are they're deeply affected by the impact of Christian Zionism on their daily reality, just as Palestinian Muslims are. They're affected in the same way in terms of the way support for the policies of occupation and control, and and this notions of the Jews only are entitled to the land, which many Christian Zionists believe that they have an equal impact on Christians and Muslims alike. But you can't help but imagine how Christians in the Holy Land, who represent the Christianity of the first century. I mean, they are the continuation of a Christian community that has been there for 2,000 years in the land. They're the current manifestation of that, and because they have remained there through the centuries, and their families who came before them, Christianity has remained in the Holy Land, in the place of its birth for all this time. They've exported Christianity to the rest of the world, but there's been this community that stayed there in the land of Jesus, continuing to carry out his mission and to follow his teachings and to live out his call in that place. So you can imagine when there are Christians from the outside who are coming and involving themselves there, and writing these people out of the story, and really saying that they basically have no place here. their role in the story is very minor because they're not Jewish, and God gave the land to the Jews, and then all the ways that gets manifested and played out. So you can imagine how hurtful that is. And so that's what we often hear from Palestinian Christians, how either wounded or offended they are by the way Christians from the outside have too often sort of sized up things and written them out or ignored them altogether, and just completely pretended as if they don't exist. Or the other thing that often happens is that they try to divide them from their Muslim neighbors. So they try to create these wedges to suggest that that the real fault line in Israel and Palestine is not between sort of the Israelis and Palestinians in that conflict, but it's between Muslims and Christians and Jews on the other side. And so they try to separate them out and paint them as victims of Islamic persecution and so forth. And that goes against the experience or the values of most Palestinian Christians themselves. So those things are very hurtful. And then you have amongst this larger Christian community, which is mostly Orthodox or Catholic, you also have the small number of Palestinians who are evangelical. There are several thousand Palestinian evangelicals there, and they often many of them have been educated in American Bible colleges and seminaries and so forth, and have read a lot of the same books and really think and talk about their faith in the same way as a lot of American evangelicals, and yet they have this sharp divide when it comes to their reality and the way that American evangelicals think about and interpret it and the things they support. So that's also that's also incredibly troubling. That community has been really outspoken in the last 20 years. And they've been trying to get more and more access to the right kinds of platforms and other places where they can actually make their case. They've faced a lot of opposition. They've been shut down a lot, but they've been very persistent in continuing to try to tell their story to American audiences. They've written books. They travel a lot, and they've really made a difference in helping a lot of American Christians kind of open their eyes to a broader story, a broader set of narratives that's really important for them. I've known many of these folks and the leaders in that community. I've met with them for years. You don't hear them calling people to switch teams and become pro-Palestine and anti-Israel. They're actually doing the work that almost everybody, Christian, Jewish, and Muslim, who's doing the work of trying to do conflict resolution will say is that it's not about being one team against the other. It's about working with all of us on all sides who are trying to find a more just reality, a more safe and secure reality for us all to live in. That's based in equity and equality and all those sorts of things. And that's the message that they often deliver. And in that way, I think they're having an enormous impact. And they've also even been in relationship with some of their sort of theological and ideological adversaries and calling them into conversation around they've had conferences at the Bethlehem Bible College for a number of years where they call American Christians who come from one of these other Christian Zionist backgrounds to come meet with them, and let's discuss your ideology and your theology, but let's do it here in the land, in the reality of our lives, and so that you can at least put your theology into a context and see how it's playing itself out on the ground. And I think that's had enormous impact.
That's really helpful. I've got one more question, but I just want to throw it out there to the group. We're shifting to your questions next. So we'll have a chance for some to be asked while we're recording. If there are some you're happy to have go on the record or you think might be helpful for other people here too, we'll ask those first. And then if not, we can also then kind of end the official recording, go off the record, and have a conversation with just those of us in the room. I think that time is really valuable, and we'll miss those of you who are joining us after the fact on the recording, but also want to make sure we have that processing time for the folks who are able to join us live. So if you've got questions, be thinking of them or go ahead and put them in the chat. And while they're doing that, Todd, I think my last question, and I don't know if I prepped you for this, so I might be putting you on the spot, but I think you'll have a good answer, is if I'm someone who doesn't feel like they know a whole lot about Israel-Palestine or knows so much but doesn't know where to start the conversation, and I run into someone who starts sharing some of these Christian Zionist views or has this very Christian Zionist worldview, what do you think one of the best places to start a conversation to help them shift their thinking is? Like if I'm in an elevator, if I have 5 minutes, if I'm at a dinner party, where do I start? Because we've discussed so much of the detail and nuance, but what's a good place to start trying to help folks see the harm of this ideology and then also a different way forward?
Well, I think helping them, connecting them to Palestinian Christian stories is a good first step. You don't want them to stay stuck there and not care about Palestinian Muslims too, or Jewish Israelis, but really helping them to connect into the Christian story experience, because most people don't know that, and if they do, they may not know it, and they may have a pejorative view or an uninformed view of who Palestinian Christians really are. I remember taking an American evangelical pastor on one of the trips a number of years ago, and we went and met with a Palestinian Christian family in the West Bank who are doing the work of nonviolent resistance as their land is being threatened, and they're trying to push back, but fully through nonviolent means that are rooted in their own Christian faith. And he was very moved by the experience with this family. Many may know the 10 of Nations, the Nasser family. And he said, when I came here, I knew they were Palestinian Christians, but I didn't think they were really Christians. I thought they were just kind of like culturally Christians, but not really Christians. He said, I'm leaving here wondering if I'm really a Christian. And I think that, exposing people to the stories of Palestinian Christians, Christian Zionists, at least forcing them to confront the fact that they have co-religionists there, that they are commanded to be in unity with in some way. And so they have some obligation to kind of listen to their story. So getting that information into their hands in some way. There are a number of them who've written books. There are documentaries and films, other things about Palestinian Christians. And again, that's a good on-ramp. And I do think that it's always good to keep in mind that people change their minds and change their hearts, but rarely, if ever, because they got argued into a new position. So it's not about having the right facts that you can throw in someone's face in an elevator conversation to flip them around. It's about inviting them. It's about asking them questions, and it's inviting them into spaces where they have the opportunity to be changed. And that can often happen through story, through experience, through relationship. But story is a great place to start. Just getting them access to someone else's story that they hadn't heard before can be very eye-opening, and it can be the on-ramp that allows them to go on a journey of change and transformation.
And we can share some of those stories and resources that we know of and like too to help spark that conversation. Thanks, Todd. Anything else you want to say before I open it up?
I'm interested in having a conversation with these folks. Let's do it.
Awesome. So yeah, anyone, feel free to just unmute and jump in if you're comfortable. Go ahead and grill Todd a little bit. This is
and we're going to talk about the film too, right? We're going to talk.
Yes, I think we'll wait and
Are
save.
you stopping the recording or?
If anyone has a question they're willing to ask on the recording, for the learning of those who couldn't join us, I'd love to have it recorded. But if no one is comfortable with that, I'm also very happy to stop the recording and have us dive in outside of that.
Well, excuse me. Hi there, everyone. I'm certainly comfortable being on recording if that's okay with folks.
Yeah.
Hi there, Todd.
Hi.
Hi. So the film, to me was a series of body blows. It was very, very painful to watch. But the thing I wanted to ask you about was the scene where the pastor says, "Love thy neighbor as thyself," that is a Christian tenet. After many things that were very hard, I'm getting a little hopeful. He sits down with the Palestinian priest and has an engaging conversation and walks out and says, "Nah." And I was just so struck by his ability to dismiss this passionate, caring story. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how the evangelical community, sort of in general, or specifically this group, is able to simply deprogram people that don't fit with their theology. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the roots of that and how perhaps to overcome it.
Yeah. That scene is, to me, it was the body blow of the film. It was the hardest thing for me, because I even after all the years of doing this work, I just in that moment, I had this glimmer of hope that conversation was going to be an opening. And when he shut it down so quickly and in that way, it really just hit me in the gut. And again, I've seen this, but it was still kind of like, it was shocking to me. The best thing I know to say is that he's deeply captive to an ideology, and that ideology includes a whole sort of dehumanizing aspect to it of Palestinians. And I have been really toying with this idea for the last several years, as I've seen sort of Christians engaged in the political arena fall really captive to ideologies that on the one hand just seem so disconnected from what they profess to believe or what core tenets of their faith are. And the best thing I've come up with, which is not very good, is that ideologies are kind of modern forms of idolatries. In the if you read the Bible and you read about the idols, and they were physical objects that manifest that but I feel like that our contemporary world has maybe its own idols, but like our ideologies have become our idolatries. We're completely captive to these political ideologies in an idolatrous way, and we're blinded from to even see things that contradict them at all. And I don't know a better way. I just don't know a better way to think about it, because it's otherwise it's not sort of rationally explainable. There's something deeper going on there, and so it's like it has this kind of idolatrous hold on us. And just one little data point, and I need to find this study because it's been 3 years since I read it, and I've referenced it a few times lately because it so captivated me. But I'm gonna go to the source on this at some point and look it up, but to get the actual data right. But basically, polling firm had been doing polling for a long time, and couple generations ago, one of the things that created the most anxiety for parents in the US was if their child married someone of a different religion than them, outside the religious tradition. That was like, oh, wow, what are we going to do about this? That's not a concern anymore. The biggest concern for parents right now is if their child marries someone of a different political ideology than if they marry outside the political tribe. And I think that gets to the way in which our ideologies have become so important to us, so central to our identity in many ways, that the sort of counterfactual of someone else's humanity is hard to break through that, because it's so existential to us in some ways. So anyway, I don't know if I'm making any sense at all. I'm still wrestling with this. That scene that you pointed out, Jeffrey, is just like, that's wrecking to me. And yet I think it really does point out that it's important to acknowledge there are limits to how effective even our work. I think our work is incredibly transformative because I've seen it transform people's lives over and over again. There's so much evidence that allowing people to enter into the lived realities of Israelis and Palestinians in the way that we do, and other programs that we run, that really does turn people around. But it doesn't turn everybody around. It's not 100% success rate. It's maybe a 90% success rate, and I'm great with that. But it does just remind you that there's no kind of magic bullet, because some people are so invested in a worldview and a way of seeing and living, being in the world, that the sort of the facts that contradict that just can be pushed aside. And we can all do that. So it's easy to kind of look at Boyd and blame him, but this stuff always reminds us, what are the things I'm missing? Where are the big blind spots in my life too? If it's so obvious what he's doing that anybody can see it, maybe there's something in my life too that I'm not seeing either. And it's just a reminder to, in some way, do that self-interrogating work as you have this, because it's easy to judge somebody else like that. Because I really I wanted to have a long talk with that boy, as we'd say down south, after seeing what he did there. But it's just like you also are reminded that there's probably work I have to do too.
I'll be happy to go next. Am I unmuted? Yes, I am. Hello everyone. I'm a Christian Palestinian, so I was sitting here listening to you talk about Christian Palestinians, and a lot of it, what you said, is true. I mean, my grandfather was a Greek Orthodox priest in Jerusalem. He was active in the sort of nationalist Palestinian Arab movement at the time to kind of try and preserve the integrity of the land, of the people. And you know, he once actually gave a major speech at the Al-Aqsa Mosque to a Muslim audience, you know, who responded with Allahu Akbar. He did all of that because of the attempts back then to drive that wedge between Christian Arabs and Muslim Arabs, and make this a more of a religious issue than it is about, you know, land and all of those things. But you know, to this day, everywhere I go, people are surprised to learn that I'm a Christian. You know, the immediate assumption is that I'm Muslim because I'm from over there. And I was born in Lebanon to Palestinian parents. But I mean, why is it so hard to expect that there will be Christians in the Holy Land and the Middle East, where Christianity was born, and to assume that it's not real? I mean, that, you know, that these are, they're not real Christians. I mean, that says a lot, you know, to me. And you know, the house I grew up in Lebanon had a picture of Jesus Christ, and he's blonde and blue-eyed, which is not unusual. I mean, you do find people with fair skin and colored eyes in the Middle East, for sure. My ex-wife was one of them. But certainly, you know, the typical person in the Middle East is not blonde and blue-eyed. So there goes colonialism for you. From the film, what struck me the most is how little the Palestinians existed in the narrative of these Christians.
Yeah.
I mean, you're Christian. How could you actually? I mean, the guy, one of the preachers, once said, you know, Jews are better than you. They're even better than Christians. So I'm sure they are way, way, way better than Arabs and Muslims. But I mean, how could a Christian actually believe that the children of, you know, of God, there's a hierarchy among them, and some of them are more important or better than others? I guess what I'm trying to say is how un-Christian this thing was in my experience. And you know, the level of ignorance is just astounding. You know, I can look at this differently if I'm looking for opportunity, because when you're that ignorant, you know, there's room for you to learn something. And perhaps this is where your work is essential.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you for sharing your story, Raja. That's yeah. I mean, I was feeling hesitant about trying to speak on behalf of Palestinian Christians. I actually didn't know we had one on the call. I mean, Greg, the co-founder of Telos, is Palestinian Christian, and
Yes.
you know, we have that in-house expertise, but I'm not it. But I think it's, you know, I have my own role to tell that story as much as I can, because I have opportunity to tell people who don't know, and who the arrogance you point out, though, of this sort of dismissive attitude of many American evangelicals in particular toward either ignorance of Arabs and the Christians in the Arab world, or just an arrogance about, you know, well, dismissing them as being somehow not really Christian. It's just so appalling, and it's tragic, but you know, it's an indicator of something, of a larger challenge within that community too.
Yeah.
Todd, I had a question, well, maybe not just for Todd, but for anyone, and I'm betraying my age here, but I like the defining moment in my like childhood that I started paying attention, I feel like, to politics was a little bit like the Bush-Gore election, but then quickly precipitating that was 9/11. And I wonder whether, and I don't know whether this phenomenon was present before 9/11, but this just like automatic association with anyone who appears to be Arab with Muslim, and then obviously all the like horrific Islamophobia that came out of that. I wonder, is Todd, in your experience, did people know that Palestinians or people of Arab descent could be like might be Christian before that, or was that kind of all like wrapped into this Islamophobic post 9/11 kind of era?
I mean, there's a long ignorance of Christians in the Holy Land, in the evangelical world, in particular. Not all Christians have been ignorant of Christians in the Arab world. Catholics have always had communities that know about their co-religionists and so forth in the Middle East, and some Protestant denominations too have been really effective over time, and in educating their people about Christians, and especially in the Holy Land. I think what happened after 9/11, though, there was just this way in which political leadership, there was political benefit to be gained from creating these stark dichotomies of that really played into the kind of the clash of civilizations model that Samuel Huntington famously came forward with, and there were plenty of people in the Middle East too that were willing to participate in that too. I mean, it's like there were those who did want a clash of civilizations, and there were people on our side who were all too ready to join it. And then there were plenty of people in the Middle East and in the West who were trying to not allow that to happen. But in the Christian world, I think there had always been there's a long history of ignorance about Islam, but also a real skepticism about Islam, and that got really played afterwards. So, and I know that for instance, even in the Ariel Sharon was prime minister of Israel during that time, and one of the first things he did, it was a very sort of deft political move, is he began to speak into American audiences to say that what you are just experienced in 9/11, this is what we live with all the time, and he conflated these two things together. And the reality is, I mean, the agenda and the goals of the kind of transnational jihadist movement that bin Laden led were incredibly different, of a different sort altogether than what the Hamas and other Muslim Brotherhood groups were trying to do, who had bought into the nation state system. I mean, like, these are kind of an apples and orange thing, but because the tactics could look similar in terms of attacks on civilians and sensational terrorism, because the tactics look the same, then this is all one thing, right? And that worked really well, and it really did cause a lot of conversation in certain evangelical circles about Islam as a vile and evil religion, and a religion of violence, and all that sort of thing. And then all kind of Arabs got caught up in that too, and no curiosity or no space for nuance to sort out those details, and it's certainly not to think about, well, what if there are Christians there, or then when the Christian presence then becomes sort of more to the fore, to put the Christians into the box they had already created, which is that it's Islam versus all the rest of us. And so to do that work to divide the Christians from and again, there are plenty of people who were willing to play along with that too. I mean, you had real persecution of Christians in certain contexts, like ISIS and others ultimately come along after the Iraq War and after the Iraq invasion, and do begin to persecute Christians. So it's not, but I think that 9/11 just really brought all of these things, manifest these things in a way that it tapped into things that were there, but there were leaders who were able to really exploit that too, and create more of create a kind of constituency around those kinds of approaches. Maybe someone else on the call would want to speak to that with a different point of view.
You've moved well beyond my area of expertise, so I will not be that person. But if anyone else wants to jump in, go ahead. About this or something else, if you want to shift the focus a little bit.
So not exactly on point with this, but I think that one of the things that really needs to be recognized is the unholy alliance of white evangelical Christianity and white supremacy. And I think that, you know, nobody really likes to talk about that much, but I remember my pastor explained, okay, so here's where I'm coming from. I do identify as I identify more as a follower of Jesus. I find the word Christian a little challenging these days because of all these different things that we're talking about. I do have Jewish heritage as well. And my pastor talked about, you know, how Europe kind of became like fortress Europe after Islam kind of really spread across everything, including into Spain, and then all of Northern Europe was kind of huddled together and sort of co-opted Christianity at that time. And that's probably where some of those pictures of Swedish Jesus, like you were talking about, Raja, showed up. And then, but that is where Christianity got exported to our continent, right? And so all of that European white supremacist weird ideas about Christianity kind of came over that way, where the Middle East and the birthplace of Christianity, the Palestinian Christians, you know, the people that were the original Christians kind of got forgotten. So, and I could kind of see it in the film, right? That sort of thread of white supremacy, even the way that pastor, like you've talked about, just dismissed the priest in Bethlehem, just dismissed him, you know, like he wasn't even worth listening to. It's kind of smacked of white supremacy to me, like just the way that someone who isn't white is hardly worth listening to, you know. So I think we need to take that into account as well. And certainly with the January 6th insurrection and a lot of the other things that have gone on that have had a kind of a Christian taint to them, I think are really wound up with white supremacy. And the other thing that struck me, Todd, when you were talking about how, and we saw it in the film, how evangelical Christians kind of see Jews as like a project, right? To just convert. It's not just Jews, right? Evangelical, like a lot, there's a strand of evangelical Christianity that sees everybody who isn't their kind of Christian as a project, not as a person created in God's image with dignity, as a neighbor to love, but just as a project. So I think that we need to take account of that as well.
Well, what sounds like what you're trying to do, Linda Ruth, also is what we call self-interrogation. So it's it's easy to cast the blame in the other party, the other religion, the other whatever, but you're looking at your own faith tradition, and you're raising questions within, and you're saying, what's the work we need to do internally in our own house, and that's the place we can often have the most impact. So I think that's a worthwhile exercise. So thank you for saying all that.
One of the other layers of this that comes up out of your question or comment, Linda Ruth, is how Christian Zionism is spreading across the globe. And Todd, you might have the numbers more at hand. Otherwise, I'll find the article and send it out as kind of post show notes with the recording. But how even as we're doing this work in the US, Telos is a part of the movement to counter Christian Zionism. That ideology is being exported globally, and so seeing rising numbers of Christian Zionism in countries that historically haven't been super involved in Israel-Palestine, for me is alarming, because it's not the engagement I would like to see. But I think that's tied into what you were saying there too, is these ideologies that are formed in one place don't stay there, and with some of the negative things that can come from white supremacy or other kind of exclusive ideologies, when they are then exported, that ideology is exported alongside with it. I don't know if you want to jump in there before we shift topics.
I'll just give you an anecdote to illustrate your well-made point. So this has been probably 7 or 8 years ago. I was in El Salvador, and we were in a little village in the mountains in a very rural area, and we had to have like a 4-wheel drive to get there. And so we are meeting with some folks, and there's this church, and we're meeting like in the courtyard of this under this shade in the front of a church, and I just stepped in to look at the sanctuary, and it was very simple, very poor community, very simple church building. In the front of the church, in this tiny little village in remote El Salvador, there's the Salvadoran flag and the Israeli flag at the front of the church. Like, the problem is bigger than we imagine. That a church in El Salvador is. But I mean, yeah, as back to your point, Linda, as Christianity is exported through missionaries, it's often, I mean, there's a whole package that gets bought. With the core of it, you also, get a lot of with the wheat, you get the chaff sometimes. And so a lot of ideologies have also gone with the export of Christianity through missiology and so forth.
Sarah, I also wanted to raise, and Todd, just that, as a Jew, it's easy to think that the Christian evangelical movement is pro-Jewish. I see it as a deeply anti-Semitic movement, rife with philo-Semitism. It others Jews and dismisses them as a tool. The man and her daughter, and his daughter, who are the head of the Organization for Christians and Jews, have really made a deal that most of us Jews could not make. They've made a political calculation that even though she's clearly uncomfortable with their philosophy, she's made a deal that because of Israel, it's okay. And that is not ubiquitous, certainly in my community. And
it's not, but it's grown, and that's where. So I last night I taught a class at a university on the West Coast. It was at 10 p.m. to midnight my time.
Wow.
I'm like, why did I do this? But anyway, I was doing this, and I was doing the kind of the history of the conflict and so forth. And I was talking to these students last night about how the 67 war really gives this huge win to these parallel movements of religious Zionism in Israel as a political force, and Christian Zionism in America as a political force. And so they had antecedents, but it's really after 67 that these come into being as kind of popular movements, and they operate on parallel tracks. They're side by side and they're not connected. In fact, the religious Zionist movement in Israel is, it's centered in Orthodox Judaism. Orthodox Jews were the last Jews who wanted to have any conversation with evangelicals. They would talk. They finally got to a place where they would be willing to talk to maybe some mainline Protestants, but like the evangelicals were the last people they wanted to talk to because of conversion and all that. And yet those go along side by side, and then they start to converge in the 90s because they have shared interests, shared political interests, shared reading of Israel and Israeli policy and what American policy should be toward Israel and so forth. And so they find that they have some things in common. They have a lot of things that separate them, and not important things, but they have some things in common. And they have, over time, really, there are leaders in both those communities who have brought those networks together into common cause. And so you see this, great friendship between John Hagee, the founder of Christians United for Israel in San Antonio, Texas, with like Rabbi Shlomo Riskin from Efrat in the West Bank, who is one of the very prominent, modern Orthodox rabbis, but also one of the leaders in the religious Zionist movement, and they've come together in great friendship over time, and so the Eckstein family, has been a part of that work too, and so these have come together, and I know for a lot of like Jewish Israelis, this is very frightening, and obviously a lot of Jews in the West are sort of mind blown by these connections, but these two movements have started to come together in some ways. That again around like sort of common political project that are really they're organically coming into relationship now in some way too. Mm-hmm. And there's a strangeness to all of that. And I guess I would just want to put in one more word about evangelicals, because it's so easy to look at these examples, and they're not like, the movie is not about some unicorns. There are a lot of folks out there like, this family that used to at the church in Kentucky, and but that's not true to who all evangelicals are, and so there are a lot of sort of things that are bound up in the evangelical movement that are problematic. And Linda, you pointed at some of that too. And yet there's also some real beauty and power in the evangelical community and the evangelical movement too. And evangelicals have, and in one of our FAQs that we try to tap into some of that too, is to give again a more nuanced view on who evangelicals are. But I've been in politics and government in Washington for a long time, and there would not have been some of the U.S. policies toward HIV, the funding for HIV/AIDS, for to try to end the war in Darfur, to do debt relief for third world countries. I mean, there's just a number of projects that evangelicals have been a big part of helping to shape in very positive ways. And so I think that's also one of the things that's so important about the work of Telos, that we're actually not just making something up out of thin air, but to the extent that we work with evangelicals, which is about 2/3 of our work in a given year, we're tapping into the potential for to a community that has a history, that has a connection to doing good and helpful things, rightly motivated in the world. And so there's, it's more than just this, but this is important. This is not. But the folks we see in the movie, the folks that lead the Christian Zionist movement in America, are not small. It's not like this little sort of quiet minority. It's a substantive minority, a substantial minority, and has and wields a lot of influence. And so that needs to be countered, but countered by, in some ways, tapping into the best of evangelical tradition to bring to bear in this way, rather than just sort of nothing but a critique of that.
Todd, I was going to jump in with where you ended there. So my background, and at heart, I am an academic, and I love the academic study of religion and religious literacy. And the two tools that I find really helpful from that I've brought to my work at Telos that I'd offer up to you all too are two principles. One, that religions are internally diverse, and two, that religions change over time. And I think sometimes it's easier to see that in other religions. Sometimes it's harder to see it for our own, or vice versa. But to hold that tension of religions are internally diverse in any faith community, there's a diversity of experience, of belief, of practice. And as Todd was illustrating, I think throughout history, you see people of all faiths working in opposition on pretty much every major issue, forming coalitions on every major issue with expect them to form coalitions with. And anytime we move towards that essentialism of, we don't say all Christians or all evangelicals, but when you start thinking that way, just to remind yourself, religions are internally diverse. There are folks who are working within those communities, within those backgrounds, who there are opportunities to partner with or collaborate with across lines of difference. And then two, that religions change over time. Our first principle is growth change is always possible. That community, the way it looks today isn't the way it looked in the past, and probably won't be the way it looks tomorrow. There's opportunity, if we belong to those communities, even nominally, to be a part of that change as we move forward. And I'll get off my soapbox there, but those are the two things that came up for me in the context of that. I think we're going to end the recording now. We can continue the conversation, but for the sake of the folks who've joined remotely and are catching up later, we'll go ahead and end the recording here. But I hope if you didn't join us live this time, that you will next time. And we'll send out this recording along with our two FAQs. They're pretty in-depth, one on evangelicalism and one on Christian Zionism. Feel free to look through those as it's helpful. And again, if you haven't seen the film yet, hopefully some of this discussion prompts you to want to see it. That link will be active through next Thursday, the 26th. And you're welcome to share that with anyone, friends and family who you think would benefit from watching that as well. So Mike, if you want to go ahead and stop recording, we'll see you next time. But those who are here, don't leave yet.